Mr. Ingbretson is a state representative of New Hampshire. He's 4 terms, 5 terms, 6 terms. And he did one time ran the camp newspaper, I think 6 years ago or so. And so he's no stranger to camp. And he gave a class on how to influence elected officials. He was also an intern for the New American magazine some years ago and wrote a very great article, which I can make available to you if you like. I think it was called Art and Revolution. And he is an artist. He's a very humble. He's got bad handwriting. Can't get it. But he is one of the most gifted artists I've ever, not just known, but ever observed. He's incredible. He's very humble about it. He said it's just a skill that some people do better than others. He said when people leave my instruction, they can get $10,000 for their painting. So, like, you don't just, it's not paint watercolors, so paint by color, you know. So anyway, he has an art studio. And he was very more than happy to come here and give a class. Let's give him a nice warm hand.
And the American Opinion Library was the beginning of my education. There were no birch camps back then. What Hal's doing now is an astonishing service, really, for kids way younger than what I was then. And I have no end of appreciation for the value of the reading that the Birch Society provided, especially what Wells called the original sources, which I'm sure you've all been looking at. In any case, I'm going to give you some rough idea. As an artist, it was extremely difficult to get an education in the direction I was trying to go, which is, of course, from the inspiration of Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and all those guys. And so what we found, though, over time, what I found over time was that we had been blocked intentionally. And because they were trying to change the arts to be useful for the revolution, and so the name Art and Revolution. Now what I'm going to do, so you don't sit here thinking that Hal's just saying things about me, I'm going to start at today in my studio and my people, and we're going to walk backwards chronologically while you get a taste, a remembrance, shall we say, of what historically art has always been. And we're talking about where the word, what enabled man to develop the concept of aesthetics. The idea of beauty and truth, the idea of goodness being a factor, the idea of elevating men, elevating your fellow, whoever you're painting for. Notice how that plays through all the paintings I'm going to show you, and I hope you have a really nice time. I think that Birch Camp should be more about pictures and less about words. Don't you all agree? Yeah? But you got to have the words. Unfortunately, here I am talking. Excuse me a second. I've been dry anyway, but speaking does that to you. So here's the art part. First of all, these are paintings. Can we get lights, guys? Can we kill the lights? Can we knock the lights on? It's never good when it shows better on my screen than yours. So these are paintings by myself. The upper one is as a well-developed student. It was one of my, it was what I would consider a sort of a graduation piece. Trying to prove that I could do all the things I needed to do in painting. The one below it is considerably more recently. It's done in fact, in the home of the woman whose church that is, that Hal referred to. That on the left is a portrait in oil. The one on the right is a portrait of my daughter, who was a Birch camper and counselor here. That's Chloe. Anybody know Chloe?
Oh, yes.
So, some of you remember Chloe. Does it look like her? In any case, this is the kind of work I do. My original inspiration was coming out of a one-room schoolhouse in Colorado. A one-room school, believe it or not, yeah, I really do look that old too, don't I? It was the very end of that era. They were starting to build. But what was in front of us on the wall was a picture, I think, on the left of no, it was George Washington, and the one on the right was Abraham Lincoln. And I stared as a 5-year-old kid at this picture, trying to figure out that blank spot over there, how he got from the nose, from that blank spot, to a finished nose, eye, or in a whole likeness of a person. And I've been pursuing the question ever since. It reminds me a little bit of the weatherman. Somebody asked him why he became a weatherman, and he said, well, I was standing outside one day and the sky opened up in the most astonishing way. I'd never seen anything like it and had to know why that was. And a lot of things like that happen too. You never know what's going to get you going, get you interested. And in this case, it's a lifelong pursuit. On the right is a Michelangelo. It's an early inspiration as well. It's the captive slave, which I think does what painting really wants to do. It's an elevated metaphor of man, our condition. We're so strong, and yet we're so... Closer or farther? Further? Oh, good. Oh, is that okay still? I would much rather be further away. Can you all still hear me back here? Yes. Oh, great. Oh, good. What a relief. This is all background. I'll get myself out of this in a second. But it's what one of the things that painting does is it wants to. All painting is about us. It's one way or another. It's about helping us to discover ourselves, helping us to get a better handle of being better, doing better, and understanding. So this is a wonderful example, though. Even though it's an unfinished sculpture, it's called a captive slave. It sort of describes us in the pre-Christian world, doesn't it, or in our own lives at times. But it also just simply describes man and the difficulty of getting, for example, an artist or you and your chosen field becoming really, really good at it. And it just feels like an uphill, maybe even hopeless battle. You feel like you're locked in, can't get out. That's very much what it was like trying to become a painter with the world sort of against you. And so these are two works by students of mine. It shows you that we worked with both those casts. Those are called plaster casts. They're casts from the antique of Greek sculpture. That on the right is Socrates. The one on the left is, I believe, Hercules. And I'm sorry, I can't tell you this. I should know the sculptor. Both of them I don't remember. And so my students do that. Then they do things like still lifes as a very basic way of learning to make pictures. And I teach picture making. And then they go on to portraits and figurative work and all that sort of thing. My teacher was, and as I said, I'm going back chronologically. We're going to end up with Michelangelo. Would that be okay? So my teacher was born in the other side of the other century, 1890s, and I met him when he was in his 80s, and very, very fortunate to have met this gentleman. He did a series based on the Hound of Heaven, which is what these three images show that are joined together. The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson, it talks about the pursuit of God. His God pursuing him. His teacher was a gentleman named Paxton. Paxton studied in Europe and taught with Todd Gamble somewhere around the 1910s, 20s, and was his friend until he died in 41. He was his mentor really into 1941. So this is showing you how late this stuff goes, right up and through the Depression. This is Tarbell. He's the nominal head of the Boston School. The Boston School is the kind of painting that I teach and study. The portrait in the middle is a judge, one of the most phenomenal portraits in American history, actually. This is De Camp, considered the greatest workman of the brush at the Boston School. Now remember the quality of these works. Remember what it does to you as well. It doesn't make you feel sick, does it? You're going to see the difference very quickly, but what's happening here at this time is these people are imbued with the turn of the century information which you're about to see of the previous century. These guys were all born in the mid to little later 1860s and that sort of range. And so they lived all up into the 20s and 30s, into the 40s even. And so here's a guy named Benson, Frank Benson. Now, this was sort of typical of the time. This John Singer Sargent, you've all heard of, and that's the top one, and the one on the right that's connected with it these are both Sargent paintings. Sorolla is the painter on the left, which is down at the Hispanic Society, and a lot of these pictures actually are available to be seen in the Boston, New England area. So I advise you, if you like this kind of stuff, to take a good tour if you've been missing out. Some of the most astonishing stuff. What's beginning to happen here is they're beginning to combine what you're about to see as academic teaching with impressionist color. My ambition is to get through this point in 15 minutes. Let's see if I can do it so we can talk about the other stuff longer. So Winslow Homer is one of the great Americans. This is all stuff that is coming out of European training, and it's just terrific in terms of composition and every other possible way. George Innes. I'm just giving you the flavor. We're working, as I said, we're working our way back. These guys are getting older and older, away from my generation. This is Dewing at the top and Thayer on the right. Dewing is from New Jersey, but Thayer was up in Maine, and he lived in this area actually, Monadnock. Yes, he did. But now, just before these guys, and while they were studying, this guy Monet shows up. And a lot of people get upset about Monet because he doesn't look like he knows how to draw. But Monet changed everything in painting when he began to realize that you could paint with a full spectrum all the time at a high chroma and produce light effects, the likes of which had never been seen, the truth of which had never been seen before. So historically, painting's been pursuing truth. And Monet is his high watermark. So when the guys you just saw before me were hitting those beautiful color notes, they were getting that from having imbibed the wisdom and the thinking of this gentleman named Monet. Don't ever underrate him. Along the same time, of course, and to get you familiar with the world of at large, the Japanese, what you're seeing with all these things, you see this inclination to beauty. Do you see the inclination to truth and beauty? These guys are highly skilled craftsmen, and the craftsmanship is a big, big piece of this. So the Japanese, look how beautiful it is, and routinely just beautiful, just marvelous to look at. By the way, the arts have been referred to as, I think Aristotle once referred to us as the arts of color. And it's a very funny thing to have it take so long for color to actually make so much difference. But it did take a while. Partly it was because of the chemicals that were developed at the time of Monet. But these guys are doing these things in print. The colors are always beautiful, but they're fairly limited in range. Now here's here's Degas. Degas takes advantage of all the color of Monet, whereas Monet was what you could think of as a plein air painter, an outdoor painter. Degas thought those guys ought to be shot to paint outdoors. He took all his knowledge, did drawings, did preliminary things, and put pictures together the way they had in the old days, and from drawings. But he got the same value out of color. In fact, he began to be the most astonishing and the first really great color designer. It's hard to talk about people like Veronese and some of the great old guys, and him stepping up so high. But it's very difficult the longer I live to, even Titian actually is considered the greatest colorist. You'll see their work as we come along. But Degas really changed, just really put that stuff to use in the most beautiful decorative way. He referred to him as a decorator out of a job, by the way. And so here, what they're coming from, all these guys have the training. This is what we call academic painting, or it's getting closer to it. These people were the mythology of the day was subject matter for them, or some of them it was the Greeks. That'll come up. But this is the Lady of Shalott on the left by Waterhouse, and the two sons of Edward, King Edward, they're about to be executed in one of those many, I'd almost call them obscene farces that happened in Europe at that time. I guess I did call it that. So here's Leighton. Leighton's Flaming June here. The use of color is very different from the others, but nevertheless, the level of craftsmanship, the idea of producing, and he produced any number of pictures would have, that have 30 or 40 or more figures in them. Just astonishing skills, the kind of stuff that we don't do. We weren't trained. The knowledge was gone by the time, and you'll see why, by the time I became a student. There's Bouguereau on the right, Gérôme on the left. Gérôme was one of the great sources of drawing education. He was the head of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris at the time that the Americans were all heading over there, the ones I showed you just previously. Bouguereau taught at the Academy Julian. That's the image of it, the dead Abel, Adam and Eve and Abel having been killed by Cain. Again, I want you to keep refreshing yourself. Do these pictures look good? Do they feel good? Do they feel ennobling? Do they feel like you're elevated in spirit or in any number of positive ways, right? It's all yes, right? To quote Emerald Root. So here you have one of the most popular painters in terms of sales of work in America ever. His name is Millet. And Millet You see, he's painting workers. He's always painting like the burden of the labor, the burden of the day. And yet when the socialists went after him and said, no, Millet is the first workers painter, he said, don't connect me with you guys. I'm not a socialist. I'm not one of you. So here he's painting this, the sower on the left. These are Bible scenes. His two significant sources of inspiration were the Bible. And so you see the sower and the seeds, and you see the gleaners. I'm sorry, the prayer, and that's, I think it's called the Angelus, but they're praying over their harvest. The upper one is a scene on a river, and it's much more like Virgil, who is his second primary inspiration. Is this boring you yet? Oh, good. Pictures never bore anybody, right? I'm in the right field. Here's an I-N-G-R-E-S, Ingres, as my wife's dad would say, who's French. And he was one of the primary influences of people like Jerome, the generation you saw just before. So we're getting to the backgrounds of all these other guys that have followed. We're getting deeper now, we're getting older. So Ingres was a big fan of Raphael, and you'll see the two pictures on the right. One is of Raphael in the Fornarina, which was one of his models. And Raphael, by the way, died at a very young age. I want to tell you, he was 33, 37, somewhere in there. And the altarpiece above is really remarkably like and yet wildly different from a Raphael, as you'll see later. And then Vermeer. Now, a lot of the big influence on the Boston School, what I come out of, was Vermeer. Vermeer is the first person who really used the full spectrum, truly. The Dutch were all painting in browns, vague versions of grays and things like that, but this inspiration is a big part of what made the Boston School, or made the connection for the Boston School with Monet, when they saw the amount of color this guy was using and how much truth there was. Monet was the first guy really to bring quite as much. And there's Chardin, one of the wonderful still life painters and the inspiration for a lot of the work we do. It's always nice, again, and we're back to the inspiration, the little child praying at table. These things don't have to be and aren't necessarily religious. However, what is the greatest source probably of our positive sense of things in the world, if it's not the very hope given in the scriptures? And one of everybody's favorites is Rembrandt. And if you haven't seen my article, somewhere in the article, that one in the upper middle, the left is always saying they're the first person that really brought spiritual ideas to painting, and they make a bunch of abstract spots and call them spiritual ideas, but they don't communicate with you. So notice these pictures. The one on the right is called The Philosopher, and notice the quality of thought that you're inclined to think just looking at that picture. The very design of the thing has you going up into his brain with him. And then of course the raising of Lazarus on the left, and the descent from the cross on the right. And I believe in one of those descents from the cross, one of the other with the cross in it, I think Rembrandt has himself, in all humility, as one of the guys helping to crucify Christ. And which of us doesn't, right? Or wouldn't be said to be that. Velasquez is another major influence. Now you're getting into the 1500s, into the 1615s. Rembrandt was in the 16s. And these are contemporaries, and so is Rubens. These are such major names, such huge paintings. By the way, with Velasquez has a huge influence on everybody in the Boston School in my era, because of his beginning to be purely visual. He doesn't just paint what he thinks or paint by the formula. He begins to use his eyes. The one on the left being a model, a wonderful example of that. You know, I know you can't know precisely what I mean, but I'm wanting you just to observe one thing. These pictures are all beautiful, aren't they? There's this wonderful quality of being elevated by looking at them. So whatever I say besides that, you'd be lucky if you get it, but you can get it. And to the extent that you're interested, it's available. But so obviously you have Christ and the fisherman. This is that moment where they've pulled up all this draft of fishes, and somehow they managed to get Christ in that boat when he was standing on the shore, but that's okay. Anyway, you see the Raphael circular one down below, which is so like the Ang that I was referring to earlier. But by the time we get to Raphael, we're talking the 1415s, 1400s. Titian is the nearest thing to modern painting, and when my 80-year-old teacher said, But what he said about Titian is never, it sticks with me as well. He says, when you're old, it's Titian. There's always this question of who's the greatest or who to aspire to. But when you're old, it's Titian. This guy is just astounding. And that's one of the great paintings, not without any question to me, of all time. The poignancy of the burial, the entombment of Christ. And what it all means to all of us. And of course, they were all doing altarpieces. The church was the Catholic Church was a good resource. Eventually, the Reformation becomes significant. And I actually ran through all that stuff that would have been Reformation before. That was in the Rembrandt era. But they all became more significant in helping, or at least that part of the church did, probably thanks to primarily the influence of the Catholic Church. And then there's, as you know, Da Vinci, the Mona Lisa, and Virgin of the Rocks. So much of the education that I experienced was based on the science of painting that was really started in any useful way by Da Vinci. Sometimes I say Da Vinci wasn't Michelangelo was the greater poet, as it were, in the world of art. You'd say the greater artist, but this guy was the greatest analyst in some significant period of time, and his analysis of painting really gives a platform. As Newton says, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. It's not so much that we're giants, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. He really did provide a platform and conversation and analysis of the nature of the visual world and about what we call the visual impression when you get to the Impressionist world, which is what I am a mixed breed of. And then, of course, you all know these images. I don't think there's a greater piece of sculpture than that. And that painting, of course, conveys so much that it's used for 1,000 symbols. So we don't have to. That's Michelangelo, of course. Now, what's interesting about the Renaissance is that it was all done in defiance of everything leftist. The left, I think it was Hitler who said history started in 1933. And the left today in Vermont, for example, says, we're just going forward. We're not going back. And the Renaissance would not have happened. There wouldn't have been that great efflorescence of opportunity for the explosion of talent if they hadn't gone back. The Greeks already had it. And so you're looking at the Parthenon in the upper friezes, the Parthenon frieze, the Heracles, I believe, on the right, and of course the Discobolus and the discus thrower and the winged victory, just being just slight examples. And so, but think about this as time goes by, though. I have more to tell you, but think about this: the Renaissance based itself on a review, of going back and saying, why are we so bad? Look at the Greeks. And they began to seriously study the Greeks. And how could you not? I mean, which one of our founders didn't go back and look, had read all that stuff that Cicero said and others to get a really better handle on what they were dealing with when they tried to form our government? So here's Da Vinci side by side, and I think it's kind of a cool model. It's a Da Vinci drawing side by side with the Belvedere torso, one of the great pieces of sculpture of all time. In addition to the Pietà, this is stuff that just has remarkable qualities that are so far ahead of anything that then happened. Would this be right in saying I'm 27 minutes into this? This isn't good. All right. I'm going to move right along. This is where it gets fun, okay, guys? We have another half of the time to go. So let's talk about the revolution. 1913, okay? It was a bad year in almost every possible way, wasn't it? Anybody who knows history? I mean, that was the creation of the Federal Reserve. That was the creation of the was it the income tax? How many other things? What an atrocity of a time. But it was also the coming forward of the Ashcan school, a totally Marxist school based. They were called anarchists in those days, but they were everything for these guys. You see, they weren't skillful. If you look at these pictures, they were not skillful painters. I mean, that's the most striking first thing you're going to see. But everything that follows, you find virtually no training these people all went out there, politics was first, and they couldn't have cared less. How do you make a figure a little bit? The designs can't be hardly called designs by standards of expertise. So, but the Ashcan guys ballyhooed themselves, made themselves into this big name, and significantly, by the way, in opposition to the Boston School, who had a show of 10 American painters, and it was so well celebrated that these guys were irritated. And they thought, and they misread it, they thought it said the 10 American painters, and they called themselves the 8. But they were, I think every single one of them worked for the new masses, did political cartooning, were socialists. The Ferrer School, I believe, was where they came out of. And did I skip something? And let me go back. I'm going to go forward just once. What they did was they created what's called the Armory Show in New York. And the Armory Show brought in Matisse and a whole bunch of other modernists that Americans thought were way below any kind of standard to even be looking at. So this picture on the right is a Matisse, the big one. And Hal asked me if any of this is going to be a little risque. I apologize if you think this is risque. This is just terrible painting. But among other people that they brought over were people like Cézanne. And if you read art histories will tell you how great Cézanne is. Cézanne, in his own words, said, "I'm just trying to do it like the masters, and I can't figure it out." And it's self-evident that he can't figure it out. And then people started theorizing with him and started making junk out of this stuff. But there's a wonderful book called The Defense of Art, written by a well-trained American painter about Cézanne, and gives that documentation. So I'm not making this up. Paul Gauguin, a similar kind of thing. But they also brought in this guy Kandinsky. And more about Kandinsky in just a second. But this is the beginning of the introduction of abstract painting to America that has this kind of remarkable effect as time goes by, except not so remarkable when you know how they did it. So, and in each of these elements of what you're seeing there, they had names. They were called surrealism or futurism or Dadaism, and they all create manifestos, oddly enough, and almost all of them would tell you to basically shoot your grandmother in the head and get on with it. In other words, don't look back. And I apologize to sensitive ears. I maybe shouldn't say that, but so futurism, and you're about to look at futurism and surrealism. This is the surrealist stuff. Now, these guys actually, some of them still had training, not as good as what went right before them, but some of them still had training. Salvador Dali, notably. This is the Cubists. They were sort of growing out of what they took Cézanne to be doing in their own fevered minds, and more of the futurists here. Now, by the way, I don't care one way or the other about this work. I suggest to students that don't bother looking at it if it doesn't interest you. And I'm not saying anything about it to pick on it. I'm just saying, does it look to be in the same stream? Because they're claiming to be coming out of the same stream as Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And I ask you, because these other guys have already shown you, the guys of the generation just before me were painting at exactly the same time as these people. This is 1920, roughly, and then a little forward. But all the way from what's his name, was painting in 1880, 1878, Kandinsky. So, and so this is the Dadaist and the famous urinal hung on the wall and said, why isn't whatever I hang on the wall painting? And so this is a dialectic. This is part of the destruction of meaning that the Marxists will always involve you in. And we're in it today. That's what gender bathrooms is about. Everything's about confusion. What's new with Satan and his buddies? Interesting. Thank you. Now I'm guessing some of you can't read this. And I'm barely able to read it myself on my screen here. So, but this is what I'm going to beginning to show you is two things. One is there's a revolution going on, and it has two sides to it. Did I do something bad here? Make that go away, expert. I just said one. So there's a revolution going on. There's a twofold revolution. One is political, as you know, And, well, of course, the whole one is artistic, but the artistic thing is both political and moral, and what we call it spiritual. So this is Paul Clay. He says, my hand is wholly the instrument of some remote power. It's not my intellect that runs the show, but something different, something higher and more distant, somewhere else. I have great friends there, bright ones, but somber ones too. And what you're going to see following now is the spiritual portion. So I'll get to the political right after. So just, if you could, can you all read these quotes?
No.
Yeah, okay. So now these are the American expressionists, okay? And no matter who I quote here, I'm quoting them from their friends, okay? I didn't go dig these up somewhere else. They're in the books about these guys. So all the American abstract expressionists of the 40s and 50s, so this is Jackson Pollock you're looking at up there on the left, and it's Rothko on the right, except Motherwell, employed automatism. Now you guys play with Ouija boards, I hope not?
No.
Automatism is inviting spirits into your life for benefit of your own personal kind, whatever you think it is. And sometimes you're trying to say things you think are spiritual. I mean, do either of these suggest anything spiritual to you? I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but I would much prefer that Rembrandt or a number of other pictures as suggesting something spiritual. At least something I could say what it actually means spiritually. So they all employed automatism to reveal what they believed to be universal symbols that inhabited the inner mind. And by the way, Jackson Pollock was a fellow student of his, told me that he spent his entire time in the cafeteria. You never saw him anywhere else. He said that's where he studied. So what would you expect, though, if they lacked skills? But you have other reasons for lacking skills, which you're about to see. Okay, so the genesis and development. Now look at, this is Maurice Tuckman. The Spiritual in Art was a major document. Can I make this page bigger? Expert, can I make this page bigger? Without messing up anything else, so I can see it. It's supposed to be, yeah, that's, except I lose the images. Can I get back to those in a minute?
Yeah, if you just make this.
Okay. Alrighty. So do you see what it says? The genesis and development of abstract art was inextricably tied to spiritual ideas current in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. Do you think that was Protestant faith? Do you think it was Catholic faith we're talking about here? Not even slightly, guys. Theosophy was probably the central one, Annie-Besant, and a lot of Lucifer conversation. Guys, it's real. That stuff here, if you want, when you get my article, look at it. I give you the documents. An astonishingly high proportion of visual artists working in the past 100 years have been involved with these ideas and belief systems. And down next, an openness toward the mystical and occult ideas that increasingly can be identified as a major characteristic of modernism itself. So that's the spiritual revolution, okay? I mean, this is not the Christian church dominating anymore. It's not Christian thinking dominating anymore. By the time we get just a little past the Enlightenment, all that stuff starts being affected. Thought's dictation, says Andrew Breton, he's the first surrealist. Thought's dictation in the absence of all control, exercised by reason and outside all aesthetic, as if it weren't obvious, and moral preoccupation. So you see how it's deviant. It's not art. It's not art historically. That's just hundreds and hundreds of years in man's history, really, of art. Doesn't include this. The Cubist artists made determined, if good-natured, searches into the realm of practical magic and alchemy, and tried to cultivate the spirit, not actually their ends. Very interested in the occult properties of images. Now here we begin with the next question. This is the revolution politically. Kandinsky was a Russian revolutionary. And so here, look what he's saying. It's this classic Marxism, dialectic, whatever. Kandinsky was looking for a new way of shocking his audience out of lethargy into involvement to prepare them for the struggle for the great utopia. That's what's happening to you guys today. Did you know that? And again, Walter Gropius, Bauhaus, the Bauhaus School dominated the arts department at the MIT as recently as 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Desire, conceive, and create the new structure of the future. And said this guy, Walter Gropius, told his pupils this, that they wanted to be part of it. They were part of a secret lodge that would help work out a great new world idea. And that's those kinds of phrases you can find over and again. So now, surrealism, it says it's an application of the same logic method. I'm going to give you pictures again, guys, in a minute. Is an application of the same logic method, dialectic and materialism. Excuse me. To the realm of art. By the dialectic method, we can explain the development of art in the past and justify a revolutionary art at the present time. They're destroying our underpinnings, aren't they, guys? Do you realize that? Surrealists are performing a very important revolutionary function. The particular method they adopt is to so mingle fact and fancy that the normal concept of reality no longer exists. Transgender bathrooms? Anybody? And then you see the next line, the surrealists are about communists. And that's a communist claim. And they all were. So Salvador Dali, of course, among them. But what I want you to notice is that communist Herbert Reed. Herbert Reed has written many books on the arts. He's a British author, art historian, art commentator, philosopher, whatever. But he is totally dedicated to this end. And he's got a lot of creds. He knows these people personally, and he knows what they're doing. Okay. So finally, painting. This is Picasso. You recognize the Guernica? This is based on an irritation with the way the Spanish Revolution went. I believe the Marxists lost that one. Painting is not done to decorate apartments. It's an instrument of war for attack and defense against the enemy. Have you ever heard that? This is from a guy, by the way, who calls himself a charlatan and a clown and not a painter in this great sense. He says it about himself. It was so I thought that was it. Okay, so and this is the last on that subject. This is in 1961. Jackson Pollock, whose painting I showed you, the drip painting, had joined the U.S. Communist Party. Almost all the originators of American abstract art had been steeped in the left-wing political art of the Depression. That's from art critic and friend Harold Rosenberg. So now we're going to get to the establishment. The ICA, the Institute for Contemporary Art, was founded actually by Herbert Reed. But guess who funded Herbert Reed's foundation, which now has many of these across the country, our country and Europe? It was Guggenheim. It was the Guggenheim Foundation. So the Guggenheims, and this is all about the promotion of perpetual revolution in the arts. Would you believe? That's their expression. That's their motto, whatever, perpetual revolution in the arts. You know, that's a fun thing to say until you have power. Do you know how much revolution they want once they have power? It's an interesting world they live in. Abstract expressionism resulted directly from the takeover of art by the establishment, according to Irving Sandler, who wrote The Triumph of American Expressionism. And Tom Wolfe, who wrote The Painted Word, and anybody who loves what I'm saying will want to get a hold of this little skinny volume. It's the most fun thing you'll have ever read, possibly, on the subject. Modern art arrived in the United States in the 1920s, not like a rebel commando force, but like Standard Oil. By 1929, it had been established, institutionalized in the most overwhelming way in the form of the Museum of Modern Art. This cathedral of culture was not exactly the brainchild of visionary bohemians. It was founded in John D. Rockefeller's living room, to be exact, with the Goodyear's Blisses and Crowninshields in attendance. There's your Museum of Modern Art. I thought I was done with these things. I apologize. I have forgotten how many I've put in here. I've never used it with type stuff before. And it's typically hard to see up here on the podium, so I've tried to find other ways of doing this. And then, so this is, just to confirm this is John D. Rockefeller wrote a book called The Second American Revolution, which some of you may have read. If you're at least my age, you probably read it. But he supports Jean-Francois Revel's view of this from his book Without Marx or Jesus. But listen to this, a true revolution is a social, cultural, moral, and even artistic transformation, where the values of the old world are rejected, where relations between social classes are reconsidered, where relations among individuals are modified, where the concept of family change, what's happening today, where the values of work, the very goals of existence are reconsidered. That's the Rockefellers. So these are a couple of their magazines that typically support this. Flash art is considered to be the greatest. You look through these magazines. I advise you not to look through them if you're children. Even if you're adults, you feel filthy if you look through these very long. You'll feel somewhere between dirty and degraded. It's really sad, but we need to know what's happening today. You need to look at these two magazines. Anything having to do with beauty and representational work will not be shown on their pages. Anything that fits what we showed in the earlier portion of this thing will not be seen on their pages. Interestingly, in this book, The Cultural Cold War, we found out that the CIA got involved in helping the Rockefellers, whose I believe it was Nelson Rockefeller's mom, whose name I can't remember. She bought up hundreds, maybe thousands of abstract expressionist type paintings in New York for virtually no money. And you know how she promoted them? Through the CIA. They actually put bunches of these works together and went to Europe and toured the major museums over there so they could come back to the United States and having been in all these museums and claiming they'd been in all these great places and increasing the value of their work just enormously. But they used the CIA, and what do you think their reason was that they used the CIA? Was to show how free America is. I mean, is the cynicism just too much to bear? And in the meantime, UNESCO is testing the public on a regular basis, every year or 2 years or whatever it is. They're asking people to say what they think in these polls of abstract painting. And they never got people to say I think 20% was the highest number they could get of people to say they liked it at all. So, you know, Americans aren't lost here, but they're certainly being messed with, right? The interesting part, if I haven't lost what do I have, 5 more minutes? Oh, am I okay? 5? Okay. I don't want to be fast in my speech. This is very important. The curatorial domination of museums. Museums used to be effectively run, but certainly influenced dramatically by good painters. When the Fogg Curatorial School started in the 20s, they indoctrinated these guys in, and these are some museum of fine arts, but they indoctrinated these people into modern art. And so the curators, very quickly they'd taken over like 300 museums, which is why, and we're talking about the major museums, we're not talking about little museums in the middle of nowhere, although even those got affected. And the first thing you know, what do you think they're doing? Even Booth Tarkington had to comment on this. They're deaccessioning this amazing 19th century painting out the back doors because it's so amazing. And it's so elevating, and it gives you this sense of can-do, which every one of us actually believes when we're young. And don't stop believing it, guys. I don't care what you think of yourself. What else you're told or what you're... But so out the back door, it's that deaccessioning is what it's called. And these pictures, when I was a student in New York in the 70s, I could have bought paintings that are now worth $1 million for $1,500. This is happening in my lifetime. So Jackson Pollock, in the meantime, what do they do with him? They take a guy who hasn't sold for more than $6,000 a picture, and they managed to get the Metropolitan Museum to buy one for $67,000, right? There's no insider stuff going on here, guys. So they get their stuff in the museums, people start believing it's art, but who gets rich? Isn't it interesting, right? These people are so selfish. In the meantime, of course, we're back to cast drawing. It's a very interesting question. These are a couple of those, the one I showed you before. What's going on at the schools, 1920s? Let me tell you. Remember the casts and the Renaissance? They cut the umbilical cord right here. This is affecting me as a student in the 70s, right? In the 20s, these schools, this is the Royal Academy, the École des Beaux-Arts, Mass College of Art, the school I went to in New York, the Art Students League, Pennsylvania Academy. I probably know a dozen names. You know what they did with their casts? They all had big cast programs. They were training, they were still studying the Renaissance, they were studying the sculpture from the Renaissance, Donatello, they were studying the Greeks. They all had their different ways of doing this. In one case, they marched to the elevator shaft and threw all of the cast down the elevator shaft. Like mass suicide, right? I mean, I can't imagine Jonestown sounding any stupider. In Boston, they marched to the Charles River and threw it in the river, all the cast. They had students carrying one each, and they threw the cast in the river. This all over the major schools. So the schools were actually taken over, and the École de Beaux-Arts, one of my students went there last year. It used to be the great school of drawing in all of Europe. And the École de Beaux-Arts, he said, "Where's the drawing class?" He said, "We don't do that anymore, we just do conceptual now." There's no drawing class, so you can't do this kind of work. So let me go quickly through what, I may have less than you want to hear here, but what I want to show you is what happens when you can't draw, and when you're just a leftist. Now, first of all, the guy can't draw. Look at that face. But look what he's making it out of. I mean, this is what you got to do today to make a name for yourself. You can't be a great draftsman with great skill and craftsmanship. You got to come up with some new stupid gimmick, right? So most of the ones I've seen by, this is Chuck Close, I believe, and most ones I've seen by him are, you know, they look like excrement smeared on the walls and stuff like that. And this is the nice stuff, guys. I'm really telling you, all the stuff I'm saying is worse, by so many miles worse. So, Sukkot, and let me quote you Sukkot. I gave you my last quote, and I could stop almost right here. I'm almost 3 slides from the end, so be patient with me, Al. Give me 2 more minutes. We shaved our heads. This is what they got instead of drawing, right? We shaved our heads, wore brooches of raw livid. We incorporated razor blades and blood into our paintings. The art schools in England have always been hotbeds. They weren't always hotbeds. The kids who go to art schools are usually the misfits of society. This is Sukkot, and these are the great works of Sukkot. First of all, she obviously can't draw. Secondly, she's got a nasty attitude. The one on the left is Reagan in a pig suit from back in that era, and the one on the right, as you see, is up to date, right? Aliens? This is an alien, so here's an illegal alien, and so obviously the Marxist line goes. The one thing that's true is that the Marxist line goes on. They have major shows at, for example, the Mass College of Art, in support of the Sandinistas back in the 70s, back in the 80s. So it was about the communist Sandinistas, right? So there you are. This is what's happening in school art. Children are now being told that their marks on their math papers are just as much art as anything they do in an art class. If you want to really see American history, I recommend American Arts. Really want to see how great America was. And mostly we've been eaten up because the institutions that used to teach have all been taken over, and they literally have been taken over, just like museums have. Gamble wrote The Twilight of Painting. This is the last point, and this is on the subject of the media. He wrote this book called The Twilight of Painting, in which he talks about what's happened. And this guy was my teacher. He wrote 5 or 6 significant books, which are very important reading for anybody who's trying to study painting as it was at the time that it was being cut off at its knees. But these things, he showed me this scrapbook full of all the editorial reviews of his book. All the major newspapers that were taken over by the Warburgs damned the book. Every single, and there were only about, I don't know how many there were at that time, I don't know if there were like 40 or so, but every single little town newspaper in the country loved the book. So you get kind of how the game works, right, guys? These guys aren't total masters. They can't control it all, but they certainly work at it, don't they? And then finally, in the Art Renewal Center isn't funding my thing. I'm not selling them, but there's a major movement of ateliers, work people doing what I do and teach the way I teach. And there's a renewal going on right now in America. So be encouraged, but also, if you're interested in this field, I would hate to say no matter what your parents tell you, there's a living to be made and there's value in it. And it's so much of what, I've met doctors who don't make any money, but they save people's lives. I've met doctors that are rich who have never saved a life and hurt more people than they've helped. There's value in the arts, guys. And so I encourage you, and in your studies, to think about it and incorporate it. And among other things, read Art and Revolution that I wrote, and read anything you can find by E. Merrill Root, especially his article on taste. And I could tell you where that is, but I won't take any more of your time. Thank you very much.